Sociology with a concentration in gender studies from the University of California, Los Angeles, as well as a bachelor's degree in viola and performance, is Arabic and Middle Eastern studies from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Our research interest includes the examination of the intersection of sound and body power, and it investigates how sound circulates effects to transform consciousness, behavior, emotion, and built environments in ways that hold potential for innovative forms of politics.
Thank you. So thank you all for being here and to Buddha for organizing this and for inviting me to present. So looking at atmosphere and the relationship between sound, music, and the built environment is a new direction for me that builds from my larger project on public feeling, political exhaustion, and DIY music culture in Cairo and Alexandria. So I started researching Egyptian DIY culture in 2010, but most of the research for this paper comes from 2015 and after. So among my Egyptian friends, there's a sense that the physical urban environment informed thoughts, behaviors, and what many of my friends called culture or mentality. These friends are mostly in their 20s and 30s, come from middle-class backgrounds, and live in Cairo and Alexandria. One female cultural worker in her mid-30s commented, for instance, that the visual pollution of public space made her and others more aggressive. She told me, quote, "You are walking and all the time all you see is garbage or people fighting, everywhere bad scenes. And after a while your eyes get used to this and you don't even feel it anymore. It makes you more aggressive, but you don't even realize it until you find yourself suddenly fighting with someone," end quote. Another friend, a musician, wrote on Facebook, "In our daily lives, the time we spend together as a society in the streets and on public transportation, unfortunately, is not full of artistic expression, relaxing music and sounds, but rather noise and at best poor music," end quote, which he viewed as detrimental to community building and overall quality of life. This prompted him to start his own street concert project that sought to transform the affects of public space and, in so doing, public behavior. Echoing these sentiments, other friends told me that urban public space was sensorially ugly and that this was one of the main reasons for sexual harassment. When people who are not used to seeing beauty see a beautiful woman, they react violently, or so they say. What each of these examples indicates is, first, negative experiences of being in public space. Many of my friends described a public atmosphere that was stressful or depressing. Second, these statements also reveal a sense that public atmosphere influences public behavior, consciousness, and culture in negative ways. Put differently, the city was understood to exert itself upon the social. Anthropologist Yael Navarro-Yashin's fascinating work on Cyprus demonstrates how the built environment produces affects in ways that transform the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and imaginative horizons of Turkish Cypriots. In so doing, she advances a discursive move that suggests that not all affects are human, indeed that there is no strict binary between the human and non-human. Expanding Navarro-Yashin's analysis of the affects of rust, abandoned objects, and urban decay as marking a conflict zone or border, I would like to examine some of the ways that the built or material environment produces affects and borders, not only visually, but via the way it sounds. Scholars of both music and atmosphere have well documented how sound can transform the built environment without physically altering its visual components. For example, ethnomusicologist Andy McGraw, in his study of atmosphere, points out that musicians are often hired to change the atmosphere and feeling of a place. And architectural theorist Gernot Boomer wrote that music, quote, "is a modification of space as it is experienced by the body. Music forms and informs a listener's sense of self in a space. It reaches directly into his or her corporeal economy," end quote. What is less ethnographically theorized, however, is how both sound and music emerges from the material aspects of the built environment. Additionally, these accounts, often taking more philosophical approaches, suggest a homogeneity of experience, a notion of atmosphere as all-encompassing. There's a general sense that music as atmosphere is largely experienced as positive, and or that atmosphere is a smooth space that prioritizes cohesion, with agency as diffuse and not located in a single object or actor. So put differently, there has been less analysis pertaining to how the same sounds circulating in and producing a shared atmosphere can inform distinct listeners' senses of self and space in contrasting ways. Looking ethnographically at the way the built urban environment is understood to sound, in contrast, reveals that even if someone is corporeally a part of an atmosphere, that does not mean that they consent to it. My friend's earlier statements indicated a sense of discontent and disgust at the experience of being in public, for instance. So this paper takes an ethnographic approach to argue that atmospheres are, by definition, composed of and through tension, constant negotiation, and negation. I will focus on two related questions. How does the built and urban environment sound in Egypt? And how might sound contribute to the production of surfaces and boundaries within a particular atmosphere? To answer these questions, I examine the politics and affects of who and what sounds in public. First, I discuss Egyptian mahraganat, literally meaning festival music, that emerged from working-class street weddings in the early 2000s as one way the Egyptian city sounds and exerts itself on the social. Performed almost exclusively by working-class male youth and mixing electronic music, hip-hop, and Egyptian shabi music, it has become one of the most ubiquitous sounds in Egyptian public space today. I then move to discuss silence, or who and what is not sounding in the street, as equally constitutive of public atmosphere, which reveals the boundaries, tensions, and negations that inform public experience. So has anyone in here heard mahraganat before? Yeah, okay, so here is just an example by some pretty famous mahraganat singers, Oka and Ortiga, just to kind of orient you on what the genre sounds like. Let me make sure. Okay, so I'm going to stop it there just for the interest of time. So one of the worst aspects of the urban built environment for my middle-class friends, at least, were the low-income areas of the city, some of which are built by the poor without permits or legal connections to the city's official infrastructure. These areas were characterized by their noise. According to the World Hearing Index, Cairo is the second loudest city in the world. In this context, the wealth of a neighborhood in Cairo can be calculated through the relative absence of its decibels. People pay for quietude. Unlike the sealed high-rises and calm of gated communities, apartments in lower income areas are often small and built close together. They line streets that are narrow and sometimes filled with street hawkers, outdoor cafes, minibuses, motorcycles, and tuk-tuks. And they're often located in less desirable areas of the city, near airports, factories, or transportation hubs. For the vast majority of my friends in Egypt, these were the areas of the city that they described as eyesores and were understood to be closed-off places that one simply did not go. As I was told repeatedly, they imagined that going to these areas would result in getting raped, kidnapped, or killed. These were abjected spaces, boundaries, as Navarro Yashin calls them, where surfaces are made and rendered tangible. In this case, the physical built environment contributed to an us versus them mentality in which the relative ugliness of place aligned with the severity of the imagined behavioral transgressions of certain problematic others. The noisiness of public space is perhaps one of the most recognizable ways the built environment was believed to exert itself on the social. It directly contributed to the aesthetics, production, and distribution of mahraganat music, for instance. Between 2015 and 2016, I spent time with the mahraganat group Studio Stella, which comprised of 5 young men between the ages of 20 and 24. Childhood neighbors in Medinat Salem, a low-income neighborhood about 30 kilometers northeast of downtown Cairo, directly adjacent to the international airport, they started singing together in 2008 at friends' weddings and worked as auto mechanics and grocery store clerks before devoting themselves to music. Studio Stella attributed the intensity of mahraganat sound directly to the noisy environment from which it emerged. One band member told me mahraganat, quote, spread in the streets because of the noise. People are already living in a noisy place, so they say, leave the rest to God, khali an Allah, and come on, throwing his hands in the air, gesturing like a dancing motion or that there's a party. Another echoed these sentiments, telling me, quote, there's a proverb in colloquial Egyptian Arabic that says, quote, make noise louder than the noise itself, so then it won't be noise, end quote. For these young men, it was the louder Maharaganat became that it differentiated itself from the other sounds of the street and ceased to be noise. Best exemplifying its emergence from the built environment, the genre is so closely linked to public transportation, is closely linked to public transportation, and especially the tuk-tuk, the primary means of transport in narrow, winding streets of low-income areas. One band member told me that, quote, tuk-tuks are the equivalent to Virgin megastores in other places. They are a sign of the amount of sales. In Virgin megastores, they say Amr Diab sold 2 million copies. Here, tuk-tuks measure the success of any song. How many are playing it? How widely did it spread? End quote. The notion that tuk-tuks are the working class equivalent to Virgin megastores indicates the inextricable relationship between Maharaganat and the street. It further demonstrates the street's effectiveness as an alternative means of media distribution and the failure of the state and market efforts at centralization, commodification, and control. Despite Maharaganat being largely ignored by these more mainstream outlets for being too vulgar, it has nonetheless attained widespread listenership among Egypt's urban population. These material realities have directly influenced the sound of the music itself. Studio Stella maintained that the kick and the snare, what make up Maharaganat's characteristic maqsoom rhythm, as well as the distinct timbres produced by the auto-tune saturated vocals and the keyboard, are some of the only sounds that could penetrate an already saturated sonic environment. They also suggested that extremely high volume was a practical feature, telling me, quote, this level of people in the street won't understand you if you don't shout. These people are so stressed. So when you make music for them, you need to make music that releases all this stress, the burden of the whole day, end quote. In other words, its practitioners believed Maharaganat to positively transform the negative emotional dispositions, some of them caused by being in public space. One went on to say that, quote, people want something to make them happy because nothing can make them happy now. So Maharaganat music can make people happy. It's happy music, end quote. This suggests that they understood volume to work in ways almost similar to tarab, musical ecstasy, of classical Arab music in which listeners' emotions, moods, and in some cases consciousness is transformed through an emotive feedback loop with improvising performers. Connected to the necessity for high volume, the members of Studio Stella actively sought out physically feeling the music in their bodies. One told me, quote, you need to feel the music. I'll sometimes go and stand in front of the speakers just to feel the music. You know the sound of the beat. Dum, they yelled really loudly. It hits my heart. My heart feels the kick, for example, end quote. This physical experience of music was highly sought after because, according to the band, Egyptians will not attend a wedding or a party unless it has music that will make them mad. Young people especially go to weddings to become, quote, someone who is made a maniac or made crazy by the music, end quote. They thus understood the music as akin to a mind-altering substance with real physical effects. One of the physical signs that someone has been made mad by the music is the distinctive style of dancing that has emerged through the genre, which I'm happy to talk more about in the discussion after. So scholars have theorized the atmosphere through and in some cases as movement, including shifts, transformations, movement suggestions, or becomings. We can see that movement is central to Maharaganat, the physical movement of public transportation, the transformation from feeling stressed to feeling happy, or in some cases mad in public space, and the unique ways the music compels the body to move. Music scholar Anahin Kasabian argues that feeling the bass in your chest demonstrates the extent to which hearing is essentially a form of touch. Similar to the city's dust and dirt that lingered on skin and clothes, or the way its garbage and ugly sights made one aggressive, Maharaganat indicated how the urban environment touched and stuck to the individual. But unlike settling dust or a light brush against a standing building, it not only touched the surface of the skin, it reached more deeply, physically moving the body's inner organs. It made itself known in, on, and through the multiple layers of the body's surfaces. If garbage and physical decay were the visual noise of the city, Maharaganat its sonic counterpart. But in the absence of being able to physically transform their built environment, Maharaganat artists experienced listening to the genre in public as a positive reworking of public experience. In short, it was at once a sounding of the material environment at the same time that it transformed its atmosphere from one that was stressful to one that was experienced as happy. So returning to Navarro Yashin's claim that the environment emits politically charged affect, the ubiquitous public sounding of Mahogany was, for more middle-class listeners, political. It emitted the wrong affects and suggested the wrong movements. Many friends described its dancing as violent, its timbres as harsh, volume as excessive, and lyrics as vulgar. In short, it encompassed the affective world of a problematic hypermasculinity and sounded the status quo of a built environment that made people aggressive. Indeed, sexual harassment in Egypt is overwhelmingly attributed to working-class men. Put differently, Mahogany was a way the ugliness of the urban built environment forced its way into the bodies of listeners. For those not willingly involved in the genre, it suggested a what they called culture or mentality that seemed to celebrate and exacerbate a problematic reality. It aestheticized the fact that the public environment was noisy and made people more aggressive. As Studio Stella admitted, the purpose of music was to make people mad and forget the stress of daily life. Seeking to transform the problematic atmosphere of public space, as well as the culture and mentality it was believed to foster, many young Egyptians were involved in public beautification projects in the immediate aftermath of the 2011 revolution. These grassroots, youth-led projects were meant to reformulate the experience of being in public space through cleaning it, enforcing particular laws and codes of conduct, and transforming its visual and sonic aesthetics. Anthropologist Jessica Winiger has demonstrated how these projects privileged middle-class subjectivity and the ways they sought to shield bodies from dirt, organize the chaos of Cairo's traffic, and implement codes of conduct centered on politeness and personal space. Within these projects, the public soundscape was likewise a major concern. Dozens of street music projects emerged in the years between 2011 and 2015, for instance, and my previous research examined how they attempted to transform the public atmosphere by infusing it with new affects by performing not mahraganat, but independent music, a DIY genre that encompasses a variety of styles, many informed by Western rock, electronic music, and hip-hop. In so doing, musicians attempted to transform public behavior, mentality, and culture by altering the soundtrack of public life. Previously limited to small cultural spaces, the sound of independent music was a new sound in public space. In some ways, we can read these street concert initiatives as what Steve Goodman calls the, quote, policing of affective tonality, a sort of war over the vibrational body and its power to affect and be affected. Since the Egyptian military returned to power in 2013, the state has removed independent music from the urban soundscape with ever-increasing intensity. Independent music is not common in public transportation. It simply isn't noisy enough, perhaps. And dozens of the NGOs, cultural centers, and small venues that traditionally housed it have closed down due to more restrictive laws and unsustainable police demands for bribes. Independent musicians are likewise being harassed and imprisoned with greater intensity, and even large commercial concerts of the most famous bands, such as Kairoki and Charmoufers, are canceled due to the state's concerns over security. All of the street concert initiatives begun after 2011 were forced to cease by 2016. In contrast, mahraganat, in both recording and live performance, continues to be more pervasive than ever in the street. Thus, one of the ways the state, as well as differently positioned state subjects, mark their territory is through who sounds and does not sound in public. The relative public silencing of independent music meant the inability for many urban middle-class youth to connect or vibe with their environment. Put differently, they felt a profound disjuncture from the prevailing public atmosphere, which has led to almost pervasive feelings of alienation and depression. Mahraganat's aesthetic emphasis on dancing and the affects of happiness, despite whatever troubles the country may face, make the genre all the more jarring for these listeners. In her sensorial study of the Egyptian state's mandated curfews during 2013, anthropologist Maria Frederica Malmström argues that the sound of silence is more intense, does more than sound. Silence is more dangerous, she contends, because, quote, it produces an ambiance of strain and uncertainty. The sound of silence means a loss of navigation, a temporary lapse in orientation, end quote. It was one of the ways the new Egyptian regime marked its territory and controlled its population. She concludes that the sounds of Cairo and their marked absence have the ability to create a sense of belonging or inflict a sense of conflict and chaos and instead foster separations. If atmosphere is produced through sound, As Riedel claims, music is atmosphere. How then can we account for silence? Does sonic absence likewise produce atmosphere? And how do you study absences and their effects? In the absence of political and social power to influence and exert some measures of control over public atmosphere, my more middle-class friends have employed strategies to distance themselves from noise and, by extension, the negative atmosphere of public space. As just one most obvious example, instead of taking taxis, public buses, or microbuses, the primary domain of Mahogany music, many of my friends prefer new ride-sharing apps Uber, Careem, and Swivel. The preference for these apps is strongly linked to desires to control their environment and experience of being in urban space. These apps allow passengers to see estimated drop-off and pickup times, and most of these vehicles either did not play music or allowed the passenger, at least in theory, to have a say in the music that they were subjected to. In his study of urban experience in the West, sound studies scholar Michael Bull argues that listeners' movements through everyday urban spaces have a cognitive, aesthetic, and moral significance that inform how listeners relate to their surroundings, others, and themselves. Through the use of personal stereos, for instance, users attempted to create manageable sites of habitation, transforming their experience of urban life and constructing boundaries around the self. For my friends who sought to shield themselves from the dirt of the city, views of its garbage and other eyesores, as well as its sonic pollution, they similarly attempted, through their listening practices, to take back agency from atmosphere. Controlling the porosity of their own bodies was a means of controlling their senses of self, what my friends called mentality and culture. In short, they sought to control and define their own becoming. Mahogany is one way that the environment literally got into the individual and through what my middle-class friends experienced as violent force. Even with the use of personal stereos, it still shook the body's organs. Returning to Boomer's claim that music modifies the space, for middle-class listeners, Mahogany did not modify all that was wrong with being in public. It exacerbated it. It added noise to noise. Distancing themselves from Mahogany was at once to create a boundary between themselves and the built environment, as well as the mentality and culture they imagined it to produce. So to very briefly conclude, sound, though it seemingly boundlessly permeates spaces and bodies, can likewise produce particular tensions, frictions, and boundaries within atmospheres. To use Sarah Ahmed's term, it is one way various layers of an atmosphere stick to individuals and not others. Mahogany, for instance, produced contrasting emotions in listeners who shared an atmospheric environment that they similarly described in negative terms as stressful. I've thus argued that atmospheres are composed of and through tension, constant negotiation, and negation, and we thus need to be attuned as much to silencing as sounding in their cultivation. Thanks.
Yeah, did anybody talk to you about auto-tune, the significance of it in Mahogany?
Yes, definitely. So that was part of what they called Mahogany's power. So they kept using this word power. Everything in the genre was all just about power, and they used the English word power. So they said that, so when I went to a recording session and reviewing how they were recording, you could see the veins on their neck popping out because it wasn't so much singing as it was just like projecting as much as you could. And so they said, when we're projecting this much, we can't sing a melody without damaging our vocal cords. That was what they said. So they said that auto-tune is the melody. It creates the melody. And it also was part of what made people crazy. They used the word like mahous is like part of what made, was a part of this affective thing that it had going on. So they said, we tried to sing Mahogany without autotune and the audience completely refused it. So they also commented on like, well, everyone in popular music now, Amadou Diab, guys in the West, everybody uses autotune. So autotune is one of these really sticky subjects that more middle-class musicians are like, you don't know how to sing, you're just putting autotune on and saying whatever. So they were really quick to defend the use of autotune, that it was like a primary aesthetic of the music.
And that relationship to craziness, is there anything more explicit said about how that works?
It's one of those things that I think is hard to articulate. So I think it was just the sheer force of the music hitting you, which was, the auto-tune, the volume, the level of the bass. It was all of these things combined. So like actually going to these weddings, I was like stuffing my ears with earplugs, you know, like it like physically hurt me to be at these places. Like I felt like, oh my God, am I gonna have like a heart attack? Because it was just so unbelievably loud. And then they're telling me, oh, we go and stand in front of the speakers, you know? So I think, you know, it was just part of the overall, my sense of it was a part of the overall power. So when you have this much volume, I mean, you can't really even hear what they're singing or the vocals, but you do hear like the auto-tune somehow through all that.
And I have a theory about auto-tune.
Okay, I would love to hear it.
It's
Yeah.
perfect for a generation that lives in an in-between world. You know, between living online and living in materiality. And it sort of perfectly expresses that. And hence maybe its ubiquity. You know, as a technique and technology. But that's interesting, that relationship to the craziness. Because it suggests something else about the effect of technology. It's pushing you know, the most human expression, which is the voice, into this kind of strange other world.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd love to talk with you more about that auto-tune. Yeah, thanks. Hi. Thanks.
Why was it not, well, not forbidden, but when the new regime came to fore? So why did it have no problems with this kind of music?
Yeah, that's like a really interesting question, and I mean, all we can do is really speculate as to why that is. So this genre emerges out of Egyptian shabi music, which was also very street-based music, and it was played at weddings. So like these, you know, like a concert of independent music for 50 people will be canceled, but there'll be a concert in the street with 1,000 people for Mahogany, and nobody has a problem, seemingly. And I think it's because independent and certain genres of music are seen as political, whereas Mahogany is seen as like anti-political, like it's anti-politics, like it's not trying to change things, like it is the status quo, like it is the problematic reality, noise, and stuff that we live in. And Mahogany artists and shabi artists have been able to get away discursively with saying things in lyrics that other musicians have not been able to, but it is really interesting to think of like an authoritarian regime and why they're so interested in control and all these things that they have these big concerts, but they're all in these like these areas that are seen as like closed off from the rest of the city, like the areas that, you know, regular people don't go. And these are areas that it's been widely kind of documented that the state really has no control or influence or presence in these places. So so in that sense you can see it as even a more political genre because it kind of sounds that which the state is unable to control. And I think that also gets to why some of my more middle class friends hate it so much, because it's like it does all of these things that they want to do but can't because the state is much more present in their lives, I think.
So it's more like tolerated in confined areas.
Yeah, and so it's like definitely in these really low income areas. I mean, the state, I mean, really only goes in there to like arrest people and harass people, but they aren't there to like maintain much order, really. I mean, if you think of like low income communities anywhere, it's like the police are more of just kind of like the assholes that come in, you know. So I think that's kind of part of it. Yeah, but that's something I've wondered a lot too, because it just seems like it's such a weird contradiction. Thanks for your question.
What about your experience, your personal experience? Maybe some more also, you know.
Of what specifically?
Of this research. I mean, when you were talking about, I was going to these parties. I had to ear plugs. These kind of things may add some.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it was definitely really hard for me to do this research as a foreigner woman, because it was kind of like my friends that sang Mahogany were like, we can't take you there, like you can't go in there, like people are crazy, and so I don't know how much of it was just like this hype, and like if you also saw in those videos, it was like a very masculinized space, like those were men, and a lot of times they're shirtless, and like sometimes they're even like stripped down to their underwear when it's really hot, and it's just like bodies of men. So, you know, I'm kind of like in the corner, like trying not to be noticed really, but obviously I very much am, but it has been more difficult to really get access to these spaces and do the kind of really close, like ethnographic, like hanging out with these guys in their daily lives than it was for like the independent middle class musicians. So so my research is a little bit biased more towards how do middle class folks interpret the music as opposed to like how the Mahogany artists interpret it themselves, because it's been harder to access them because like my femaleness was like this big thing that was like you just couldn't really get around it. Yeah. No, yeah. I thought like, what if I do dress in drag? Can I like butch up? And I'm like, no, it's not gonna happen. But yeah, thanks.
I wonder if you could speak to how other maybe local or regional or more globally circulated, if at all, more globally circulated musics figure into this conversation.
The conversation, like, tell me more.
There seems to be this spectrum we're thinking about right now between the DIY and Mahogany, and it maps on pretty beautifully to working class versus middle class, the loud versus silent, to state-sanctioned ethics versus something more revolutionary, for example. And I'm wondering if at all things like the mass-mediated popular music, like the Gitana music, or or other forms of music that are practiced in Egypt. So like you mentioned Shabbat, which is still like alive and but, or less urban musics, for example. I know lots of Lebanese DIY alternative musicians perform in Cairo also, right? So I'm wondering whether, if at all, they figure into this conversation in any way, and how they
Okay, so I think if I understand your question, so I kind of presented this very neat binary, and it's definitely a lot more messy than that. Like Kairoki and a lot of the big independent bands are teaming up with Mahogany artists to try to gain access to that audience. So there is some go-between. And in terms of like the globalization of like these genres of music, Mahogany has become really popular among foreigners, especially in Europe. Like it's become really a hot genre in electronic dance music festivals, I'm not sure. So foreigners love it. And then whereas independent music has struggled more to get a foreign audience, because it's like, well, why would I want to listen to rock in Arabic when I could just listen to Metallica, So there's kind of like this kind of jealousy going on there. But they're both very cosmopolitan and globalized and worldly genres because Mahogany artists are drawing from all kinds of different things, not just localized things, as well as the same way that independent musicians are. So does that answer your question?
We can talk about
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Did you think that taking a kind of contemplative distance from the performers would help your research, or do you think of involving autoethnography, like giving the devices to the musicians themselves so that they can comment on the practice?
Yeah, sorry, can you say that again? Sorry, I missed the first part of it.
Did you think that taking kind of a contemplative distance, or the distance you are talking about, like us and them, because you have mentioned that so there is a division between your positioning as a researcher and the subject of study, that's the musicians. So do you think it is useful taking this distance, or we wanted to involve the musicians into the research by involving autoethnography or other kinds of?
Yeah, I think the distance is going to be there. Like I don't pass as Egyptian, like I speak Egyptian Arabic, but like I look very white to most people. So it's really difficult for me to be like, I'm in this with you, especially because I have an American passport. And that creates all kinds of different privileges and things like that. So I think there's always this distance. Even when I'm talking about middle class musicians, like there's always, no matter how much I want there not to be. But in terms of Mahogany, I don't know, I feel like it's more biased, my research. So I wish that because I have more distance from the Mahogany guys than I do from the independent musicians. And so I just think that I have much more data about how terrible Mahogany is supposedly, and less of these very interesting kind of accounts of what the music means to the people who make it. So I have a little bit, but not as much as the negative. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I think that the distance is inevitable, and I guess that is what it is.
Is it useful?
Is it useful? I'm sure that it is useful, but I guess it gets to, I think, this question of critique, maybe, and it's like, what is my role as a researcher? Like, is it to critique all of the power relations and what people are doing, or is it to be like, here is the worldview of the people that are, and like there's only so much access I can have to that. So I think certainly being an outsider, it allows me, for example, to do research on Mahogany, because for independent musicians, they like won't even touch it. You know, they don't want to engage with it at all. So I think having that distance, I don't have the same biases and negative kind of associations that are like embodied in me towards Mahogany musicians. I'm just kind of like, well, why do you hate it so much, you know? So it does allow me, I think, to go in with more of a clean slate in that sense, so that I can create like a different type of critique. But yeah, I'd like to talk with you about that more, about what you think about that. Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you guys.
Next, Mahogany is a Canadian contemporary artist who is currently based in Cairo. There he directs the visual arts program and is an associate professor of practice at the American University of Cairo. His work explores sound and what he calls the gobetween of the corporeal sensory.
Great, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Beirut, and I have to say Beirut is kind of amazing. I think it's an incredible place. So, and thank you for organizing this, because it's really nice to be together with other people talking about sound in different contexts. Speaking of sound, here we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about. Still going to do that, is it? Okay. I have a grand problem.
You can consider that as kind of site-specific element.
Sorry? Yes, this is a performance right now. This is a performance. We will get used to the noise, right? That's how it operates. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit. I guess I'm going to fix this display first, is what I should do. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some current research. What I'm talking about today is very new. So this is all in progress. And I'm now the director of the visual arts program, which, what does that do? That keeps one very busy with administration. So as a result, I'm unfortunately not in the position to always be talking about research, which is sad. Sorry, I'm just trying to gather these windows. All right. Well, I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk a little bit about noise, and I'm going to talk about it within the context of Cairo. And why is this doing this? Okay. I'm going to do this within the context of Cairo. And I have a bit of a paper that I wanted to start with. It's basically how I used to think about sound. This is talk a little bit about where I'm coming from with noise, and then I wanted to talk about how I'm thinking about noise quite differently now from being in Cairo, and it is hugely different. Sorry, it's usually don't run into this problem. All right, why don't we just keep that lovely thing up for you guys to look at? This isn't having to look backwards. Okay. Yes, this is what we find in wonderful Egypt. So I'm going to talk about where I came from with noise and what I'm looking at now, which is definitely social and political. I would also like to say that part of what I'm trying to do here is to pose some questions to you. I'm not going to be giving you lots of information. So I have questions for you, so please keep that in mind. So I'm going to be referencing a couple of older texts here, one of which is from Jacques Attali, starting with him, talking about the culture of noise and invisible history. So he writes from the beginning, for 25 centuries, Western knowledge has tried to look upon the world, has failed to understand that the world is not for beholding, it is for hearing, it is not legible but audible. Our science has always desired to monitor, measure, abstract, and castrate meaning, forgetting that life is full of noise, and that death alone is silent. Work noise, noise of man, noise of beast, noise bought, sold, or prohibited. Nothing essential happens in the absence of noise. I tell you. This statement resonates. It boldly sheds light on an ocular-centric history, a history that's been excised from and integrated back into the cortex of visuality. Seeing is anything except knowing. It is rather an affirmation that the visual world mirrors the mind's eye. Our ocular-centric history is blind to the ontology it has so graphically borne. This eternal recurrence of modernity itself seems a kind of unbreakable cycle that I'll attempt to unwind through research around the invisible, and namely the noise of modernity. The term itself, noise, is questionable. What differentiates noise from sound and music? Why are the distinctions made? Where can there be triadic relationships? Nothing links these elements of audible perception. Noise, music, and sound are culturally determined phenomena. Without anthropologizing these mutually exclusive bits of invisibility, I'll attempt to delineate where distinctions can and cannot occur within this relationship. So we can talk about, obviously, noise as a kind of information disturbance or thwarting of clear communication independent of the message being transmitted. A fellow Canadian, Armor Schaefer, talked about this some time ago. He talks about it within a very subjective context. Noise as being an undesirable sound signal, noise, the static on a telephone, the wrapping of cell phone candies during Beethoven. A dissonance for one age and one generation or individual may be a consonance for another age, generation, and individual. So the didactic and redundant binary of consonance and dissonance are set up by Schaefer as components of noise. Interpersonal subjectivity is itself a kind of noise or information disturbance linked to individual perception. My sense of noise is different than yours, as are my hearing capacities, tolerance to noise, perception of noise, annoyances, possibly comfort through noise, are relative areas of subjectivity in this vague field of undesirable sound signals, shifting through cultures and epistems. However, when we hear Attali writing about noise within a musical context, and this relates to today's, I think, conversation, he calls it a weapon, and music primordially is the formation, domestication, and ritualization of that weapon as a simulacrum of ritual murder. Within the context or grouping of communication transmission, Attali's description of noise has little to do with Schaefer's musical terms. Rather, it focuses on the process through which and by which noise occurs with the sender, sending device, and receiver. Okay. So I just wanted to start with this because this is kind of how I used to think about noise. and I still do to a certain degree, but then I moved to Cairo, and things have changed. So okay, here we go. Okay, voila. No. This is so hard to do backwards. Sorry.
Good review.
Okay, thank you. Slides.
No. View the upper.
Oh, the upper. Oh my God, I didn't even see this. Thank you.
And then presentation present to view.
Thank you. I think my brain is. Thank you. See, I need your help here, obviously. So, bless you. So I'm talking about the beginning of something, and to talk about noise in Cairo, I think this is probably not a bad place to start. How many of you have been to Cairo before? How many of you? Okay, so if you've been to Cairo, you've heard Call to Prayer, but I will tell you that it is an absolutely otherworldly experience for those of you who have not. And there are key locations within Cairo where you can hear many, many mosques simultaneously amplify. Yes.
So where were you living before Cairo?
From Canada.
You're Canada. Where in Canada? Because it makes a difference.
Toronto. Toronto. Yes. Sorry. So here we go. This is a field recording of Call to Prayer in Cairo. So I could play this longer, but I think you get a sense. We also are obviously listening in stereo sound within this space, and we're not positioned physically. That's why I was asking about being in Cairo, because it is an otherworldly, very sensorial and very spatial, physical experience to arrive upon call to prayers. Sorry. So this is an interesting part of the soundscape, of course, of Cairo that's happening routinely every single day of the year. I also think it's important, I'm sure some of you are aware of the important Egyptian artist, composer, Halim Eldad. Wire recorder piece is something I just wanted to play a little bit from. A really important Egyptian composer who moved to the States and lived many years. He was teaching at Kent State University in the United States. And some people talk about him as doing wire recording pieces before Pierre Schaeffer was doing musique concrète. I'm not going to get into all of that kind of thing right now. But I just want to play a little bit of his work because I think it's really important to look at some of the lineage and some of the work that's already been done in Egypt and by Egyptian artists, and some people are not aware of. The work was actually first premiered in 1944, actually at AUC in Oriental Hall. I'm going to play a little bit of this, and what we're about to listen to is actually, it's called Expression of Zar, and what you have is a field recording of an outdoor kind of ceremony, which is basically kind of like an exorcism is what's going on. And then what happened is Halim took it back to the studio and basically tried to augment or ameliorate the overtones and modify the sound a little bit. And this is what you get as a finished work, which is, I think, otherworldly would be another good description. Here, right there, the overtones going. So he explains with this, I just started playing around with equipment at the station, including reverberation. This is an Egyptian Middle East radio. I just started playing around with equipment at the station, including reverberation, echo chambers, voltage controls, a re-recording room that had movable walls to create different kinds and amounts of reverb. I concentrated on those high tones that reverberated and had different beats and clashes, and started eliminating the fundamental tones, isolating the high overtones, so that in the finished recording, the voices are not really recognizable anymore, only existing as overtones with their beats and clashes. This is what can be heard. Okay, so what I'm going to do is also going to look at a couple of different Egyptian artists who I think, in a way, Halim Eldad has kind of helped form a little bit of the foundation for them to carry on and do some very interesting work. Before I do that, though, I think this complements a little bit of what Darcy, what you were talking about here. This is, it's been a very interesting year and a half in Cairo, to say the least. And what I'm going to show you now is a little bit of a video that is available online. And okay, so here in Egypt, there's only so much you can get online, right? It's things are controlled pretty carefully. But this is available. And what is this? This is women dancing in the streets. I mean, it's fairly controlled dancing, but they are dancing. This is part of the election that happened this past March, right? And which was a very interesting experience in a whole bunch of different ways. One of which was musically what was going on is you had these polling stations that became DJ booths, right? And you had music kind of belched out of them really loud. So, and then you had a lot of people dancing around with Egyptian flags and usually a lot of CC paraphernalia and shirts and stuff like that. That's where you go to vote. So it seemed like, I wasn't sure if the election was done or if it was beginning. It was kind of unclear. And then actually, if you look at the election, it went on and actually was extended. And people had to vote or they had to pay a £400 fine. So it was a very interesting learning process for me. But what happened, there's become this kind of interesting and strange culture where people dance, specifically women can dance during elections. And this is a holdover from when Sisi took over power. This is exactly what happened. People were allowed to and could not be criticized for singing and like dancing in the streets. So this is now a culture that's happening. So here we actually have what we're going to show you with this video is you have a very carefully orchestrated staging is actually what's going on. Of something that's going on with supporting the government, but with some speakers in the back of the truck, obviously. But it's actually playing a fairly vulgar song, but it's been edited within the video so that you can't tell it's a vulgar song. There's so many things going on with this one video. It's incredible. So here we go. There's been a bit of different research concerning this, but what's really interesting is that basically the Egyptian government is saying we're kind of taking the Americans' approach on how elections work, which is, I mean, like as you mentioned earlier, Obama having his song, like these politicians kind of aligning themselves with different musicians. So this is an opportunity for Sisi to say, all right, look, you can be free. Very strange and very interesting. I won't get into all the details. However, you didn't see it on the back of this truck, but Mahogany and also the track. This is part of that culture as well. These are really important kinds of speakers. This is what's actually spewing out all of this music. They often have built-in echo, and it has these kind of aesthetic things that trickle down from it. But you find these in Ataba, like a very interesting souk market in Cairo, where you can buy one of these sets for like £1,000 for like $50 to $70, and then boom, you're making really loud music and kind of. But I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's important as kind of a subcultural phenomenon within music and the musicology we're talking about here. So yeah, getting back to noise, there's kind of political noise. There's many different layers of conceptual noise. There's music, aesthetic at all levels. We can talk about noise in so many. This is something I just found from the New York Times. It kind of captures it quite well. It's like a city where you can't hear yourself scream. I find, for example, when I go to downtown Cairo, or most throughout Cairo, I wear some pretty good over-the-ear headphones. And I'm not just doing that to listen to music, I'm doing that because actually, I really do think you get hearing damage when you're in downtown Cairo. As you said, it's the second loudest city in the world right now, it seems. Also, then people who are trying to sell you stuff generally don't bother you as much because they think you're listening to music. But, so different observations. Okay, so I'm just going to play a little bit of audio. This is what happens. This is Ramses Square, the traffic. That's pretty low key. Like it ramps up quite a bit from there. But what does this do? I mean, this affects your psyche, obviously. It hurts, you know, physiologically it can do damage to you. And there have been studies to prove this within the context of Cairo, medical studies. But how do you communicate through this? Well, there are ways to do so. And you find people actually changing the frequency of how they're speaking to actually cut through basically the sounds of the noise of Cairo, which I find very interesting. So often, that's a way to get somebody's attention 30 yards away, or, well, 10 feet away actually, because you can't hear them, you can't talk, right? Communication changes. So the communication, one thing I've noticed as well, I've called this garbage bin, but in my neighborhood, I'm in South Cairo and Mahdi, but what I find fascinating, we do not have this in Canada, but absolutely, it's something fascinating in Cairo, is this this kind of oral cultures where you have people communicating based on sound effects, okay? And it happens at a huge level. So in my neighborhood, I have at least 10 distinct different sounds that are created by vendors. One of them is, well, I'll see if I can get this one. I just caught this the other day very quietly. You'll only hear it for a split second. That's it. This is the garbage man, right? Yeah, which means, I'm coming to get your garbage. But the next one is a little, I don't know if you have this one here, but this is, okay. So immediately when you hear this, okay, that's the guy selling gas. I gotta go downstairs. Actually, we're low on gas right now, so I'm gonna buy some gas. This is something I find strange and interesting within the context of Cairo, and we'll throw out Egypt, but is the fact that vendors are sonic, right? They're selling things, and we've been talking about selling things maybe maliciously, but they're selling things to let you know, you need to come downstairs because I have the baladi bread. You need to come downstairs because I have the gas. Very simple and kind of utilitarian. These are things that I am looking at right now artistically and thinking about, okay, how do all of these components go together to create this really dense, kind of noisy soundscape? So it just activated it all at the same time. That's closer to what Cairo sounds like, actually. It's that by about 25 million, right? I'm just going to present you briefly something I've been playing around with. Again, these are ideas that are cooking. It's a slow cooking kosher I'm trying to make here. So the tuk-tuks, Darcy was talking about, all of the cars, all of the traffic, all of this congestion, people constantly moving things around, moving people. This is, I find fascinating and interesting. And what I really noticed was the sound of the city. So immediately, I started to imagine, okay, well, what can I do to kind of actually modify this, this really chaotic soundscape? And the immediate first thing I thought of really was to think about how to work with traffic. Okay, so I'm an artist who works with traffic, I guess. So what I imagined originally was working with tuk-tuks and actually having musicians or different kind of recordings playing and organizing a choreographed kind of dispersal of these kind of musicians in space and seeing what we could do. Logistically, it became too insane, and so in the end, what I have here is basically a much simpler sketch of where this work is kind of going. So we'll start here, and I'll play a little bit of this. To explain what I've done is gone around kind of Cairo, shot some places from the car's perspective. I mean, recording in Cairo, that's a whole other element too. The permits involved, like the politics, the everything, try to get the permits. So this is done kind of on the slide. But so what I've done is I've taken some of these images to think about how people are moving through Cairo and the noise that's building. And then I've given this to musicians and say, okay, now I want you to respond to this, and I want you to use this kind of as almost like a graphic score, and to think about what you can do to harmonize, to antagonize, to add something. So this is the first out of several of these kinds of experiments with André Segon. We're having some video issues here, sorry. think my RAM is kind of I'm having some troubles with my RAM. So the very simple idea is basically to give some of these videos to artists to then work together. But the idea is then to kind of layer them physically in a space to recreate, to rethink kind of the noise soundscape, a noisy soundscape within the context of Cairo. I'm going to move on because the quality there, unfortunately, is a bit problematic here. So other artists I was mentioning earlier who I think are really important within the context of what's happening with Egyptian kind of sound art and music and how, they overlap at times. Hassan Khan is a very interesting artist who has a very interesting contemporary art kind of practice, but also works electroacoustically making music and working in music studios, inviting in musicians, recording them to play 20 minutes at a time, repeating cells, and then building with them. And then what he'll do is he will bring these recordings, kind of recompose, and set up a simple kind of, a mixer and kind of rewriting device to mix back into itself and create feedback systems. I'm going to play just a little bit of this, but what I find interesting with his work is, and I've seen him perform, is that when people experience his work, at least in Egypt, there's some moments they're very musical, they're very danceable, and they're aesthetically lovely. And then it kind of morphs into these walls of noise, or whatever you want to call them, that are, just loud and get in the way of the dance and the music. And then it morphs back into something that's musical. And I think there's something about this aesthetic that I think is very, very interesting and very important within the context of Egyptian art. Sorry, I'm just trying to get specifically at 2515. There we go. Here we go. Find these really strange and wonderful passages, and then you'll find these other very elegant sections that are much more musical. We hear some drones going, we hear the strings, and it gets modified and tweaked live. That's kind of a performative experience, electroacoustic. So what we're hearing first was called Foam Tone Generator and Pedals, an early work from Hassan Khan. We can talk more and more about the noise of Cairo. I don't think I need to go into more depth about that. I wanted to present just one last thing here. I teach a bunch of different courses at AUC, but one of which is time-based media, and it's a great opportunity to get students to think about the relationship between, to think about sound and bring attention to sound. And I have one assignment that's basically a notation assignment, and the student really took it in a very strange direction, which was great. In the end, it was actually one of the strongest pieces. She broke the rules of the assignment with the strongest piece. So for this piece, what they're supposed to do is work with a pre-existing recording and find a way to actually notate it or make it visual, and based on kind of frequency, amplitude, timbre, the basics in terms of how you structure kind of sound. And but instead of doing that, what she did is she recorded a friend and doing Zagruta. And so I'm not saying it well, but it was a Nubian friend of hers who's doing Zagruta. And what she did is she layered it. She did a little bit of editing to the sound, which she wasn't supposed to for the assignment. But she found a kind of ready-made video of lights that actually worked very nicely with this recording. So I'm going to present this to you. This is some of the fun stuff we get to do in class. very simple, but I think quite effective. And so Zahuta we find like for weddings and whatnot, for celebrating, right? Okay. All right, so I need to finish up. The last thing I just want to, I know I've kind of thrown a lot of strange things at you here, but what am I getting at? This is something that I'm starting to cook right now, is that I just wanted to throw it out there to all of you that in early April, Christophe Magone, it looks like Jessica Thompson, hopefully Hassan Khan. There's several interesting artists who work with sound are going to be coming to Cairo. And I realized, well, then I need to do like some sort of festival or conference of some sort. So I'm suggesting you stay in touch or keep an eye on what's going on at ADC, because in early April, this will happen. And specifically what you find here, these are feluccas, right, you find on the Nile. And the Nile itself has a very interesting, amazing sonic space. So one of the great things about doing things in Cairo is that it's actually quite cheap in certain ways to work. So you can rent a bunch of feluccas for very cheap, and you can have sound artists work with them. So this is something that will be part of that project, as well as working with a couple of galleries as well to do kind of a mini sound festival. So I'm just sending that out to you to say that if there's anyone interested in kind of talking about this or where this might go, please let me know. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
So I was talking about spring 2019.
Did I put 18? Yes, it happened.
It's
No,
19.
it should be
Okay.
19. Thank you for picking
No,
that
just-
important detail. Good, yeah, good eye. Any questions?
You said in the beginning, when you started with Atelier, you said that being in Cairo made you change your mind, or some kind of development in your thinking about noise.
Yeah.
So, can you say a little bit more about that in relation to Atelier?
Atelier? I mean, Atelier's work I think is very, very important and very interesting in so many ways. And the commodification side I find very fascinating. And when he talks about noise and mass production and going hand in hand, talking about music coming from ritual, all of it I find is really quite brilliant. In terms of how things have shifted for me in terms of Cairo, I think it's trying to get more specific and more kind of socio-political as opposed to I mean, he does in that text, he goes into some details concerning like how the advent of the printing press and, composers being at the right place at the right time and lawyers showing up at the same time lead to, pop stars of the classical world. But beyond that, there are a lot of kind of generalizations that are just more, I guess, philosophical, I guess. Yeah, but I mean, that's a good question. That's something I need to kind of work on. As I said, all of this is like brand new, very new, like what I'm starting right now, basically. But I think Atelier, for me, is a part of that kind of foundation in some regard. Sorry, I don't have a real answer for you, in other words. Sorry. Any other questions? It's almost like I've given you a big question as opposed to a big answer here, so which is probably the wrong thing for me to do. Yes?
I wanted to ask about the video, the movie, the thing, the truck, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So do you know where that was filmed, or did you see that in Mahogany, or were they in specific neighborhoods, or?
They were in specific neighborhoods. I don't know where that one came from. I pulled this one, like that's what I found interesting, is that I found this one and it obviously had been edited in a way that actually even changes. You don't hear all of the lyrics of the song, for example, right?
Yeah, because that song is like, as you know, it's like a Mahogany Power song, so it's like really interesting that it's used in like this state context, because usually that's like the anti-modernity that the state is trying to like, Well,
and that's exactly why it's edited, though, because there's certain words that they don't want to be behind. But no, I just find it also really strange and fascinating, because in Mahdi there were a few of them. And there was another practical thing, is that you could hear where you're supposed to go and vote, right? So I mean, that's kind of useful, I guess, on a functional level. But actually, once you got there, it was very confusing as to what's going on, right? Okay, so an election has been won, or do I vote, or is there anybody else to vote for? Like all of these kinds of questions kind of come up in that context. Or why are people celebrating was another obvious one. Because, I mean, you don't find generally a whole lot of public music, right? It's a very noisy city with little public music. And there are theories concerning the fact that you don't want to get too many youth together because they might be very subversive, right? And start something new. Yeah.
Was this organized by the Sisi party? This sonic attraction, let's say.
I don't have a for sure answer, but I think so because it was everywhere, and he for sure was complicit with it. Yes, I don't know if he started it or whatever, but he was complicit with it for sure, absolutely. Which itself is just loaded with so much to think about in so many ways. But yeah, I mean, so how do we use music? How is it used and as a tool, a political tool as well? I didn't get into, but there's another interesting thing that happens, and some of you may be aware of. You do also get different pop stars writing songs that are like, hey, you need to get out and vote. And these ones talking about like democracy and these kinds of things, which are played at some of these polling stations too. So that they're done every few years, and they're very strange to listen to because, I don't know who's paying for those, but you know.
If you mention anti-modernist approach, what do you mean?
Like the Mahogany music is seen as, it's like the government has a certain idea of what modernity is, but the Mahogany is seen as like subverting that because it's seen as vulgar and crass, and so it's like not so to have it be the music of like Sisi's campaign potentially is like that's new to me. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that. That's like, yeah.
Yeah, it's so confusing with so many levels.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, last but not least, I do have a bunch of text here concerning some Egyptian artists and others. I think we're working with sound and whatnot too, so feel free to take them because I have more. Yes.
I see situation exchange.
Oh yeah, okay. That's my own propaganda. Yeah.
There has been developing a practice that crosses boundaries of sound, listening, music, and material since 1970. This encompasses improvised music offerings, writing, electronic sound, field recording, exhibition curating, sound art installations, and opera. It includes 7 acclaimed, including Affective, 1984, Version of Sound, 1995, Sinister Resonance, 2010, Into the Mainstream, 2016, and Flutter Echo, a memoir first published in Japan, 2017. Briefly, a member of David Cunningham's pop project, The Flying Lizards, in 1975, he has released 13 solo albums from new and rediscovered musical instruments on Brian Eno's Obscure label, 1975, and Sound Body on David Sylvian's Samana Sound label, 2006, to Entities, Inertia's Faint Beings, 2006. These 1970 Amazonas recordings of Yanogami, Shamanism, and Ritual were released on Sub Rosa as Lost Shadows, 2016. In recent years, his collaborations include Rai Nakajima, Akio Suzuki, Tanya Chen, John Bucha, Ken Ikeda, Elaine Missioner, Henry Dreams.
You don't have to read all this out.
I think it's endless.
Right, let's stop then. Thank you for the invitation. It's interesting, we come here to talk about sound, listening, sight environment. Yet we try to do so in this room, which is so impossible. And it so often happens. So we end up fighting architecture and aspects of technology, acoustics. I don't have any lecture for you, I'm afraid. I just have notes and quotes which hopefully go towards thinking about some kind of ecology of emanations and absorptions which relate to our understanding of sounding and listening. And for me, there's a very strong relationship between what I'm doing here, which may seem to be text-based, and what I'm doing tomorrow in performance, which may seem to have a closer relationship to, say, music or oral history or the enactment of resonance and vibration. But actually, my practice is really about trying to bring these together. So to have them in separation is, it's okay, it's practical, but it's also a falsity. So like I say, I have quotes and notes. So the first one is from Peter Sloterdijk. His huge work, Bubbles, and the first book, Spheres. And he begins this epic by talking about a child blowing bubbles. The bubble and its blower coexist in a field spread out through attentive involvement. The child that follows its soap bubbles into the open is no Cartesian subject, remaining planted on its extensionless thought point while observing an extended thing on its course through space. In enthusiastic solidarity with its iridescent globes, the experimenting player plunges into the open space and transforms the zone between the eye and the objects into an animated sphere. All eyes and attention, the child's face opens itself up to the space in front of it. Now the playing child imperceptibly gains an insight in the midst of its joyful entertainment that it will later forget under the strain of school. That the spirit, in its own way, is a space. Or perhaps one should say that when people referred in former times to spirit, what they meant was always inspired spatial communities. This one is from a book called Pol Pot, The History of a Nightmare by Philip Short, where the Chinese communists at a later stage in their civil war had used bugles to communicate. The Cambodians employed wooden flutes, whose banshee-like wails, echoing through the night air, instilled terror into their opponents. This is from Jane Austen, Mansfield Park. A young woman, pretty, lively, with a harp as elegant as herself, and both placed near a window, cut down to the ground and opening on a little lawn surrounded by shrubs in the rich foliage of summer, was enough to capture any man's heart. The season, the scene, the air were all favourable to tenderness and sentiment. Mrs. Grant and her tambour frame were not without their use. It was all in harmony, and as everything will turn to account when love is once set going, even the sandwich tray and Dr. Grant doing the honours of it were worth looking at. This is from George Eliot, Middlemarch. If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heart beat, and we should die of the roar which lies on the other side of silence. As it is, the quickest of us walk about well wadded with stupidity. This is from Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things by Jane Bennett. Worms do not intend to enable human culture, but worms do, according to Darwin, pursue what appears to be prospective endeavours. His close observation of worms led him to conclude that worm actions are not the result of an unvarying inherited impulse, but are intelligent improvisations. For example, in plugging up the mouths of their burrows with leaves, worms act in nearly the same manner as would a man. That is, they make apparently free, or at least unpredictable decisions based on the available materials. Though they usually seize leaves to be dragged to their burrows by their pointed ends, they do not act in the same unvarying manner in all cases, but adjust their technique to the particular situation and its set of possibilities. Which leaves are available? Is the ground wet or dry? What other creatures are around? And this is also from Vibrant Matter by Jane Bennett. Assemblages are the ad hoc groupings of diverse elements, of vibrant materials of all sorts. Assemblages are living, throbbing confederations that are able to function despite the persistent presence of energies that confound them from within. They have uneven topographies, because some of the points at which the various affects and bodies cross paths are more heavily trafficked than others, and so power is not distributed equally across its surface. Assemblages are not governed by any central head. No one materiality or type of material has sufficient competence to determine consistently the trajectory or impact of the group. The effects generated by an assemblage are rather emergent properties, emergent in that their ability to make something happen is distinct from the sum of the vital force of each materiality considered alone. Each member and proto-member of the assemblage has a certain vital force, but there is also an affectivity proper to the grouping as such, an agency of the assemblage. And precisely because each member actant maintains an energetic pulse slightly off from that of the assemblage, an assemblage is never a stolid block, but an open-ended collective, a non-totalizable sum. An assemblage thus has not only a distinctive history of formation, but a finite lifespan. This is from a book called Beyond Words by Carl Safina, which is about, loosely speaking, animal consciousness. Or should I say non-human animal consciousness. A researcher once played a recording of an elephant who had died. The sound emanated from a speaker hidden in a thicket. The family went wild, calling, looking all around. The dead elephant's daughter called for days afterward. The researcher never again did such a thing. And this is from Rebecca Solnit's book, The Mother of All Questions, Further Feminisms. Silence is golden, or so I was told when I was young. Later, everything changed. Silence equals death. The queer activists fighting the neglect and repression around AIDS shouted in the streets. Silence is the ocean of the unsaid, the unspeakable, the repressed, the erased, the unheard. It surrounds the scattered islands made up of those allowed to speak and of what can be said and who listens. Silence occurs in many ways for many reasons. Each of us has his or her own sea of unspoken words. English is full of overlapping words, but for the purposes of this essay regards silence as what is imposed and quiet as what is sought. The tranquility of a quiet place, of quieting one's own mind, of a retreat from words and bustle, is acoustically the same as the silence of intimidation or repression, but psychically and politically something entirely different. What is unsaid, because serenity and introspection are sought, is as different from what is not said, because the threats are high and the barriers are great, as swimming is from drowning. Quiet is to noise as silence is to communication. The quiet of the listener makes room for the speech of others, like the quiet of the reader taking in words on the page, like the white of the paper taking ink. This is from a line from a film noir called Possessed, starring Joan Crawford, made in 1947. Blood pulsation can be heard as sound. It's a common symptom of neurasthenia. This is from Byung-Chul Han's book, The Scent of Time. Leisure is not the neighbour of lazy inactivity. It is the opposite. It does not serve the purpose of distraction, but of collecting oneself. Lingering presupposes a gathering of the senses. This is from a book called Burst of Breath, which is an edited collection, anthropological collection about lowland flutes in Brazil. In other words, flutes played in the Amazonas region. In this sense, perhaps it would be appropriate to question once again the opposition of seeing-hearing in relation to the ritual flutes, not exactly as if they were two discontinuous and autonomous processes, but in relation to an indigenous definition of sensorial experience, where such domains, as well as others like the sense of smell, are closely intertwined. The first contact with the spirits is auditory rather than visual. And from the same book, it could also be the case that what appears cacophonic for humans is, from the point of view of spirits, a harmonious language. This is from another Byung-Chul Han book, Psychopolitics. And he quotes from Deleuze in this passage. The idiot does not communicate. Indeed, he communicates with the incommunicable. As such, the idiot veils himself in silence. Idiotism erects spaces for guarding silence, quiet and solitude, where it is still possible to say what really deserves to be said. Deleuze already called for such a politics of silence in 1995. He directed it against neoliberal psychopolitics, which forces communication and disclosure. And this is the quote. It's not a problem of getting people to express themselves, but of providing little gaps of solitude and silence in which they might eventually find something to say. Repressive forces don't stop people from expressing themselves, but rather force them to express themselves. What a relief to have nothing to say, the right to say nothing. Because only then is there a chance of framing the rare and ever rarer thing that might be worth saying. And this next passage is from the Flutes book again. But I mean, in some ways it's very difficult to understand without the context of the discourse within the whole book. But in this setting, the last sentence of it is the important one, but I have to read the rest of the passage for there to be a point of reading the last sentence. If women played flutes, there would be no more affinity. In terms of ritual dramatization, it is enough that there should be a conjunction between women and flutes, notably in certain ritual systems, and that women see flutes, and so flutes see women, that is to say, make love with them, for there to be no more affinity. So that's the bit which is impossible to understand without having the other context, but the sentence which matters here to me is, in other words, music is kinship. Kinship. I have no idea why I bookmarked that page. What music allows and so many other walks of life refuse is an entry into the bigger part of oneself. And this is from a book called Music Groove by Charles Kyle and Stephen Feld. Or Charles Keel, maybe. Charles Keel. And this is Charles Keel speaking in a kind of conversation, transcribed conversation between the two of them. I think it was meditating on Tibetan monastic music and trying to figure out why it is not groovy. It is very timbral and textural, with an emphasis on harmonics and overtones. And I realized that the pairing of the conch shells, pairing of the shinbone trumpets, pairing of the shawms, pairing of the bass trumpets, that all these pairings of instruments share one goal: to maximize overtones, harmonies, harmonics and beats, the throbbing of pitches rubbing against each other. I think that is one goal of music, to maximize timbres, textures, overtones and harmonies. And maybe that could be applied to the auto-tune we were talking about earlier, or some of the things you were playing. It puts you into the spiritual or supernatural above the Himalayas in a spatial head. If you wanted to account for what was powerful about Tibetan music, you would have to have a theory of texture and timbre that was just as powerful as any theory about process or syntax. This is from Carlo Rovelli's book, The Order of Time. None of the pieces that time has lost, singularity, direction, independence, the present, continuity, puts into question the fact that the world is a network of events. On the one hand, there was time with its many determinations. On the other, the simple fact that nothing is, that things happen instead. And also from Rovelli's book. The world is not so much made of stones as of fleeting sounds, or of waves moving through the sea. Things in themselves are only events that for a while are monotonous. And this is from Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Now I have one radio phonograph, I plan to have 5. There is a certain acoustical deadness in my whole, and when I have music I want to feel its vibration, not only with my ear, but with my whole body. I'd like to hear 5 recordings of Louis Armstrong playing and singing What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue, all at the same time. Sometimes now I listen to Louis while I have my favourite dessert of vanilla ice cream and sloe gin. I pour the red liquid over the white mound, watching it glisten and the vapour rising as Louis bends that military instrument into a beam of lyrical sound. Perhaps I like Louis Armstrong because he's made poetry out of being invisible. I think it must be because he's unaware that he is invisible. And my own grasp of invisibility aids me to understand his music. Once when I asked for a cigarette, some jokers gave me a reefer, which I lighted when I got home and sat listening to my phonograph. It was a strange evening. Invisibility, let me explain, gives one a slightly different sense of time. You're never quite on the beat. Sometimes you're ahead and sometimes behind. Instead of the swift and imperceptible flowing of time, you are aware of its nodes, those points where time stands still or from which it leaps ahead, and you slip into the breaks and look around. That's what you hear vaguely in Louis's music. This is a quote from a Fritz Lang film called Human Desire from 1953, and it's Gloria Graham speaking. When I first came here, I thought I'd never get used to the trains. Now, when it's quiet, I get nervous. And this is me writing a note about a book by Alex Kerr called Another Kyoto. Alex Kerr has a theory that cultures that take off their shoes and live on the floor develop a cult of how to walk. From that comes a consciousness of sounding and quietness in movement, the squeak of tabby socks in no and tea ceremony, the sliding feet of Indonesian court nobles in its relationship to Javanese dance, the teaching of children in Thailand to walk slowly and lightly to avoid floor creaks, leading to a cult of gentleness, low voices. A waitress in Thailand, he said, would never slam a plate down on the table like you might see in China. Sunday morning, walking back from the gym, a small boy and his dad passing under the railway bridge. "Where are the hippos?" asked the boy, disappointment in his voice. "Not hippos," said his dad, "echoes." This is from a novel called The Virginian, written by Owen Wister in 1902, and it's considered to be the first proper Western novel. In other words, the first novel which established the myth of the Western that we're familiar with from television and films. The seemingly respectable man now came dragging some sort of apparatus from his place, helped by the Virginian. The cowboys cheered, for they knew what this was. The man in the window likewise recognized it, and uttering a groan, came immediately out and joined us. What it was, I also learned in a few minutes. For we found a house where the people made no sign at either our fiddlers or our knocking. And then the infernal machine was set to work. Its parts seemed to be no more than an empty keg and a plank. Some citizen informed me that I should soon have a new idea of noise, and I nerved myself for something severe in the way of gunpowder. But the Virginian and the proprietor now sat on the ground, holding the keg braced, and the two others got down apparently to play seesaw over the top of it with the plank. But the keg and the plank had been rubbed with rosin, and they drew the plank back and forth over the keg. Do you know the sound made in a narrow street by a dray loaded with strips of iron? That noise is a lullaby compared with the staggering, blinding bellow which rose from the keg. If you were to try it in your native town, you would be hanged, and everybody would be glad, and the clergyman would not bury you. My head, my teeth, the whole system of my bones leapt and clattered at the din, and out of the house, like drops squirted from a lemon, came a man and his wife. And this is from an interview with Pauline Oliveros, published in a book on the San Francisco Tape Center. So Pauline says, I was very interested in small found objects that I would attach to apple boxes. You know, these wooden apple crates made great resonators. I would use things like curb scrapers from cars and little things that vibrated. The box would amplify the sounds, and I would pick them up with microphones, air mics and contact mics as well. I think I use my voice too. I use cardboard tubes to filter sound, bathtub reverberation, and whatever. It was a kind of mechanical, analog way of putting sounds together. And then I would do variable speed and drop things an octave or push them up. Mostly it was dropping things. And just to finish, Buddhaditya mentioned I had a memoir published in Japan last year, and that's going to be published in May next year in English. I wrote it in English, of course, and it was translated into Japanese. And the book is called Flutter Echo, and this passage explains why it was called Flutter Echo. If every listening experience of our lives could be recollected, the world would be transformed into an infinite space of sound, so layered in time, so thickly textured, as to be a second nature. Our minds would be continually defending themselves from a waterfall of auditory impressions. Sound slips away from the memory in the same way that water dries on a rock, its stain gradually disappearing. Some rocks remain wet, moss grows, soft to the touch, vivid green and pungent. So it is with memories of listening. Significant moments sitting in memory, like deeply embedded rocks, their place in our personal narratives changing shape over time. Maybe the rock moves a little as we come to understand ourselves better with age. At the end, all the rocks are dislodged, washed downstream. Others may find and collect them, examine them, take them into their own minds. The past is always now, chronology and continuity broken into pieces, scattered by the present pressure of living within depths of time. Images appear, flashes in darkness, may be imagined, conscious of lying in a pram in the hallway, finding a toad in the neighbour's garden, a boy on top of me, bigger, stronger, holding me down, the boy my parents tried and failed to foster after his mother died, the cattle market at Waltham Abbey, pigs screaming, on my parents' bed, transfixed by the swirling wood grain of the headboard. Hearing is more elusive. My first memory of a listening experience comes from a walk, a regular journey during my early childhood. I was born on the 5th of May 1949 in Enfield, suburban North London. My parents, both North Londoners, lived there with my maternal grandparents after World War II. 7 people, my grandmother, my mother's stepfather, stepsister and brother, my mother, father and sister, all living together in the same small house, must have been claustrophobic. Finally, in 1949, just after my birth, my parents bought their own modest house, 3 upstairs bedrooms, 2 rooms downstairs, a tiny kitchen, and a long garden in a small town called Waltham Cross. This would have given them a great sense of achievement at that time, when ownership of a house became a realistic possibility for working class and lower middle class people. In the early 1950s, Waltham Cross was still quiet and relatively rural, despite being only 12 miles from the City of London. I could see fields from my tiny bedroom. A brook trickled along the lane, and at the end of the road, across the railway line, lay mysterious marshes and the River Lee, traditionally a canal route for transportation from the Thames River into the borough of Hertfordshire. Many families moved into this area immediately after the war, hoping for the tranquility and stability promised by suburbanisation. Things could have been very different. My mother's father and older brother died in the Great Flu epidemic after the First World War. Her mother came close to death from the same illness, so she and her younger brother were placed in foster care, a traumatic experience that my mother would sometimes speak of in a guarded way, as if her brother had suffered some unmentionable harm during that time. My father was a soldier during World War II and took part in the Normandy landing. While he was away in Europe, a V-2 bomb dropped on a house in Enfield, directly across the road from my grandparents' home. The force of the explosion threw a long spike of glass onto the pillow between my mother and Sister Angela as they were sleeping. I always remember that the windows were blown out, the cat disappeared. My mother once told my daughter. My husband's photograph was in the room. Everything was broken, but this photograph stood. It didn't move, and I remember looking at it and saying, "You'll come home." This is how close we come to not existing. To visit my grandparents when I was a child, we would take the bus from Waltham Cross to Enfield, then walk from the centre of the town to their house in Bush Hill Park. The walk took us close to the railway lines. This was the early 1950s, so prefabricated housing had been built there, homes for those who had been bombed out of their houses by German planes and rockets aimed at the nearby munitions factory. I was fascinated by these small, flimsy buildings with their gardens of vegetables. There was a sense of privation and disaster, but also the optimism of starting life again. Shortly before the railway bridge that took us over the tracks into my grandparents' road, the path was bordered on both sides by a concrete wall. The narrowness of this path meant that the walls reflected echoes from our footsteps very rapidly, an effect described as flutter echo by acousticians. Like the fluttering of a moth's wings, sound bounces back and forth rapidly between the two parallel walls to create a zing, the illusion of a pitched note with a metallic quality. Sound came into focus as a phenomenon that could change according to physical laws. Not that I understood this as a child, particularly since I had no aptitude for science. Then there was a complex relationship between sound, its causation, its environment, and the active role of the listener. An active role meant not just the realization that listening is going on, but the emotional connection to the circumstances, in this case family, the consequences of war, notions of home, and the way in which something habitual, the walk from one destination to another, open out into the unexpected. A lifetime later, the same effect of flutter echo resonates within deep memory as a flutter of the heart. Okay, that's it. Thank you. I don't really imagine that any of you could have any questions. But if anybody wants to say anything, then...
I had a question.
You do have a question?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
As you were saying, there's for you a direct connection between you reading these quotes or presenting something verbally and doing your performance tomorrow. Can you say something about this relation, what it is for you?
Yeah, it's very hard to say that in a short way, because there's a long evolution to it, and I think there's a very interesting area evolving, and a number of people in this room are involved in this same process. Maybe everybody in this room is involved in the same process of finding negotiating a path through what was once seen as being divided. And so scholarly work in the past was concerning itself with predominantly with ideas and text, read and written and spoken text, and something like music was understood as being something far more intuitive. And musicians, I'm very familiar with the idea that musicians don't want to talk about what they do. I mean, as somebody who writes books about music and interviews musicians, has conversations with musicians, I'm aware that many of them are resistant to this idea of articulating exactly what it is we do. And already we've heard earlier this afternoon the idea that these things are very difficult to talk about. I mean, there's something you said, right? These things, auto-tune has a certain power, a certain uncanny... How do we describe that? You know, if we're musicians, or even if we're not musicians, even if we're scholars who are specializing in auto-tune, how do we talk about it? So, you know, as somebody who's a writer and a practitioner, I was going to say musician, but I caught myself there. You know, as somebody who's a practitioner, my struggle, I suppose, particularly I think since I've been involved with the academic world, is to find some way to bring these elements of my practice and my experience together. And I think it's not at all easy, but part of my process is embodied here, if you like. I keep notebooks, and the notebooks collect together many things ranging from quotes and commentaries to speculations and future projects, and some material which is more like a diary. And I can give you one example of a convoluted process which leads from one to the other. Many years ago I worked on a project, I did a little bit of work on a project called Reminiscence Aids, and this was in the 1970s. I was involved with a group called Artist Placement Group, and the idea of Artist Placement Group was to place artists in society. So in organizations, industry, government departments, whatever. You know, to take artists out of galleries and into these important institutions. And the project, this particular project, was researching how memories could be used to stimulate short-term memory in elderly people. Elderly people, as most of you I know, will know, are often very good at remembering things that happened 60 years ago. When my mother was dying, she told me a story about the socks she wore on the first day of her first job. And she left school at 14, and she died when she was 96. So, I mean, this is a remarkable memory. But if you would go and see to her and talk to her, the same story would come around again and again in the conversation. So, you know, the theory was then that if you played people sounds and showed them images and film from their past, then you would stimulate the memory and it would help. I mean, this is common practice now, and I know particularly in the Netherlands, it's common practice in care homes where elderly people live. But one of the things I did during that project was to interview my grandfather about smog. this industrial pollution that was such a huge problem in London. And it led to what was called the Clean Air Act, because so many people were dying and suffering. I was thinking about it a little bit this morning when I was walking around Beirut, because the air quality is not good. Although the air quality in London last week was not great either. But anyway, I interviewed my grandfather about smog, and recently I came across, this is on a cassette, this interview, I did it in 1978, I think. And recently I've been using bone conduction loudspeakers to amplify sounds using ordinary objects. So I can use my notebooks to amplify a sound, or I can use a tin can. Recently I tried using paper clips to amplify sound, and because the bone conduction speakers are magnetic, they cling onto the paper clips, and so you hear the sound through the paper clips. And there's something magical about that, and it relates very strongly to the passage I read out from Jane Bennett's book on vibrant matter. And also what Carlo Rovelli says about static objects. He says that they're objects that have become a bit boring. In other words, their static nature makes them boring, but you can bring them to life with sound in this way. So I've been using my grandfather's voice, using the original cassette, not a digital file, but using the original cassette, played through a cassette machine, and then through the bone conduction speaker and through resonating cavities and chambers just picked up from daily life. And there's something uncanny about this. To hear my granddad, who's long dead, talking about this historic event and hearing it through tin or paper. That's, I think, a good illustration of this interaction, as Karen Barad calls it. A conversation, I suppose, with different forms of practice, and how they can become, over time, more coherent as a practice and not so divided, what people call disciplines. I won't use this word discipline. It's used all the time in academia. But I won't use it because to me discipline is like discipline and punish. And it creates these kind of forced distinctions between practices, which we then have to find a way to subvert in some way or move through. So I prefer to think in terms of what I call fluidity of practice, where one type of activity can become another type of activity. And so these kind of namings don't matter so much. Being an academic or being a musician, it's not so important. So that's the one question, which is fine. Thank you.